Hi everyone, it's video 3, week 8, and where have we got up to so far? Well, so far we've given the so-called rule following paradox, which just says if someone's trying to teach you how to use a word, you can always interpret what they've done in accordance with a rule which isn't the one they've got in mind. So if someone adds 2, they say, what does add 2 mean? Well, I'm going to tell you. I'll give you the rule. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. I've just done it. You can always go, okay, right, you've done 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, but you can always interpret that behavior as, let's say, going 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, but then when you get to 10, you might still go 14 because you think that's what they would have done. So you can always interpret their behavior in accordance with a different rule. Nothing they've done has ruled out the possibility that adding 4 when you get to 10 is correct. Okay, so we've given that paradox, and then we've said, what do philosophers think obeying a rule consists in? Well, or let's put it this way. Let's give you a question. What makes adding 2, use of the phrase add 2 correct when you go from 10 to 12? And what makes use of that phrase incorrect when you go from 10 to 14? So in other words, what does obeying a rule consist in? Philosophers have said, well, it might consist in kind of somehow grasping an objective standard which we all sort of somehow grasp. Others have said, no, obeying a rule is a matter of social construction. Whatever we all agree is obeying the rule, that's what obeying the rule is. We can't all be wrong because what correctly obeying a rule consists in just is by definition what we say it is. Now, some people, as I said in the last video, have said that Wittgenstein is a constructivist and he thinks that following rules is a matter of social construction. I don't think that's right. I think that what Wittgenstein is doing in all of these passages is something quite subtle, but I think what he's doing is trying to show that philosophical question, namely, what makes use of the phrase right in this case and wrong in this case, that question he thinks is kind of ill-conceived. That is a philosophical question which only arises when you think about rule following in a certain way and in a mistaken way. What do I mean by that? I think that Wittgenstein is hoping to show us that the question, what makes that interpretation right and that interpretation wrong, I think he wants to show us that that's a mistaken question. You know, we have had this theme already in the Tractatus of Wittgenstein saying that philosophical questions are in some sense bad questions. I think he thinks that his rule-following paradox only emerges on a kind of philosophical approach. So how does that really work in detail? Well, it goes something like this. Let's say the person is trying to teach you how to use the phrase add to, and you interpret them. It's always possible for you to interpret them in the wrong way, basically, is the problem. Given their behavior, you can always provide a different interpretation of the phrase add to than the one they want you to get hold of. And that's supposed to be paradoxical, or it's supposed to be deeply problematic because it means that it makes it look impossible for us to have learnt language. It makes it look miraculous that we've learnt language. And then, because it looks miraculous, the philosopher has to come in and give it an explanation, which makes it look less miraculous, or at least, explicable. So that's the problem. The way the problem is set up is you've got someone trying to give you an interpretation, and then you choosing between interpretations. You're saying, well, God, I've got so many to choose from. I'll choose this one, I'll choose that one. And then it looks like if you do choose the same interpretation that they're trying to get across to you, then it's just so unlikely, because there's so many possible other interpretations, that it just looks miraculous. And then the philosopher has to say, well, I need to explain why that's miraculous. It's not miraculous because rule following is a matter of social construction. Or it's not miraculous because there's a Platonic standard of correctness, which we're all trying to approximate. Well, Wittgenstein starts to ask questions like, what happens to you, actually attend to your own case, when you use a word? He has quite a few remarks where he starts asking questions like that. When you use a word, what do you do? And he says, well, what I don't think you do is have a load of interpretations floating around and then choose one or choose another one, or justify your choice. So, he says in remark 201, it can be seen that there is a misunderstanding here from the mere fact that in the course of our argument, we give one interpretation after another, as if each contented us at least for a moment, until we thought of yet another standing behind it. What this shows is that there is a way of grasping a rule which is not an interpretation. So he's saying this paradox only arises when you start to think of following a rule as making a choice between interpretations and then having to justify that choice. That's how the problem emerges. And that's what he says in remark 2.01. Well, he says, or he tries to get you to see that that's wrong. That's a kind of philosophical model of what it is to follow a rule, but that's not what happens when you use your words. You're not aware of a rule, you're not conscious of a rule floating in front of you, you're not faced by different interpretations. Okay, you don't have to make a choice. You don't justify your using a word correctly or incorrectly in 99.9% of cases. You don't give reasons. So the philosophical problem emerges because it looks like we've got someone with one interpretation in front of them and another person with infinitely many interpretations in front of them, and they've got to somehow choose the right one. And then it does look completely miraculous that you would ever choose the right one, but we do use words regularly, we agree about our use of words, and so, it looks like there are miracles. And Wittgenstein wanted to say that model is a kind of peculiar philosophical invention. That's not what happens when you obey a rule. You're not faced with interpretations and then you choose one of them. So that's one of Wittgenstein's key points. He thinks the problem emerges because of philosophical assumptions about what it is to follow a rule, which are false. And that's why I don't think that Wittgenstein's a constructivist, because that would involve his giving an answer to a philosophical problem which I don't think he thought was a good problem. I think his approach is to show you that the philosophical problem is in error, not that certain solutions to the problem are in error. But we still need to have a kind of positive case. So Wittgenstein starts to say things which are a bit more positive about what it is to follow a rule, rather than just negative in the sense of what it isn't. It isn't choosing between interpretations. What does he say then? Well, he says following a rule or learning how to use a word is a custom or an institution. What does this mean? Well, he doesn't elaborate at great detail, but I think what he means is something like this. We have all sorts of customs which we do, cultural practices which we engage in all the time. For instance, when someone doesn't say thank you in certain situations, you might raise your eyebrows. Okay, that's a thing that people do. Now, when you do that in the correct circumstances, in the appropriate circumstances, not because you're aware of a kind of rule which says raise your eyebrows in these situations. You just do it. That's his point. He says you just do it. He says, well, his phrase is, I follow the rule blindly. He says you do it because it's a custom, it's a cultural practice which you're engaged in. You can't give reasons, or you don't give reasons for why you've done it in the one case and not done it in the other. And he wants to think of language use as a kind of cultural institution, which it's kind of not, it doesn't really make sense to ask why people do the things that they do when those things are sort of cultural practices. Why do you raise your eyebrows when someone doesn't say thank you? It's our custom. That's as far as the explanation goes, basically. You can't explain it in other terms. And what does this all mean? I mean, I'm being brief here because, we're going to have 2 hours to discuss it in person. But I think that's his drift. And what it means is that language use is essentially social, it's public, and he asks whether someone could follow a rule on their own, and he indicates, in my view, that couldn't happen, or whether someone who'd never been part of a society could follow a rule, and I don't think he thinks that's possible. So just to recap, the problem, the rule-following paradox, occurs or emerges only because of a certain philosophical view, or a kind of philosophical view of what following a rule is, i.e. choosing between interpretations or being conscious of different interpretations. Now, if that was true, it would be miraculous that we ever used words in the same way as one another, because there are always going to be infinitely many interpretations of word use based on a given finite set of behaviour. So Wittgenstein, there are philosophical answers to that. We use words in the same way because we're all trying to approximate an objective standard of correctness, or we use words in the same way as one another because we're constructivists, and correct use just is using words in the same way as one another. But I don't think Wittgenstein's giving a philosophical answer to a philosophical problem. I think he's saying that the philosophical problem only emerges because of a bizarre, false view of what following a rule is. And he wants us to see that following a rule doesn't consist in one's being conscious of different interpretations, selecting them, giving reasons for them, and then attempting to act correctly. Rather, following a rule or using a word in a certain way, in a correct way, is a custom, cultural practice or custom. And we can't really give further explanations as to why certain customs prevail. When you are engaged in a custom or a cultural practice, you don't have reasons for what you do. You do them because you're embedded in a culture. And that's what language use is like. And if you begin to see that, you see that the model, the philosophical assumptions at work in the problem aren't true, and the problem kind of dissolves. And Wittgenstein thinks that it's by attending to your own use, by looking at real-world examples, that you can come to that understanding, you can see that the philosophical model that causes all the problems is just a product of too much abstract theorizing and not enough paying attention to actual cases of language use. Okay, so that's it for video 3, and indeed for all the videos for this week. Difficult stuff this week. Tricky because he's doing something very, very subtle, and he's trying to get you to stop thinking in that kind of philosophical theorizing way. It's very difficult not to do that though, and we'll see how far we get in the in-person sessions. But we'll have 2 hours to get into it, as always. Okay, thanks everyone, and yeah, good luck with the reading. Cheers.